such a large turnout, an eclectic group of people here to listen to Dr. Kyle Bishop's talk today. I'd like to thank the Multidisciplinary Psychoanalytic Research Cluster, and in particularly the faculty sponsors Jim Smith, Lee Zhang, and Naomi Janowitz. I want to thank DHI and the English department, as well as STS, the Department of Religious Studies, and the Anthropology Department for generously co-sponsoring this event. And in particular, of course, we want to give a very special thank you to Matt Nesbitt, who tirelessly coordinated this. And you can also thank him for the brain food at the back of the table, which he was very insistent about, and which is typical of his general zest and enthusiasm for the Psychoanalytic Research Cluster. I also want to thank Chao Tzu, our technical coordinator. Okay. Dr. Kyle Bishop's eclectic scholarship, which has captured the attention of academics and media worldwide, spans zombie studies, film and screen studies, American studies, and post-colonial theory, in addition to American literature and popular culture. Dr. Bishop received his master's in English literature and American studies with an emphasis in film from the University of Utah, which was then followed by a doctorate in American literature and film from the University of Arizona. His forthcoming book, Zombies Among Us, Manifestations of the Walking Dead in Post-9/11 Popular Culture, will be released in 2015. And his very popular American Zombie Gothic, The Rise and Fall and Rise of the Walking Dead in Popular Culture, first appeared in 2010. Additionally, he's edited a special edition of the Journal of the Fantastic and the Arts, titled Afterlives, What's Next for Humanity, with our very own Dr. Sarah Loro, who graduated recently from our graduate program at UC Davis with her doctorate. So in addition to publishing numerous book chapters and articles, Dr. Bishop has given interviews and media appearances for the Los Angeles Times, Miami Herald, the Huffington Post Live, Wired Magazine, and other media outlets. He's also appeared in a number of documentaries and television series. Dr. Bishop is currently professor and chair of the English department at Southern Utah University, where he received the Tanner Distinguished Faculty Lecturer Award in 2012 and Distinguished Educator Award in 2010. So today he brings us a very exciting talk, The Stalking Dead, Zombies, Freud, and Uncanny Valley, in which he'll discuss how zombies, liminal creatures both alive and dead, operate as uncanny creatures that objectively remind us of the thing which strives to repress most, our own inevitable mortality. So on behalf of the Multidisciplinary Psychoanalytic Research Cluster, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Bishop as our inaugural 2014 Freudian Sips Research Talk Series speaker for Freudian Sips number 8. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kyle Bishop.
Thank you. I gotta stop doing stuff. It's too long. So can I hear from the undergrads in the room? We have some undergrads in the room. That's how you hear from? Graduates? Graduates in the room?
Yeah.
Who's the grad? Faculty?
Yeah.
Hey. There we go. I'm really happy to be here. I'm super excited because I got to fly in an airplane today. And I like to fly in an airplane, and I missed Chair's meeting today, and I like to miss Chair's meeting. But I really like talking to you. You are the group of people I have chosen to care about for the rest of my life. Young, excited, interested people who have this little bit of a slant towards the morbid and the awkward. I've been studying zombies for 10 years now. And it's kind of cool because when I started it was a little bit anomalous, and now zombie studies is actually a thing. So we have classes on zombies that you can take. We don't have a zombie program yet. I think that might be a little bit too much. But we'll see. And I've just kind of been going along, trying to figure out what's been happening. I got lucky. I did my dissertation at the University of Arizona with a group of people who were really open-minded. I think they were just sick of dissertations on Shakespeare, and I had something weird, and they said, well, let's go for that. And I worked with some really great people, and I managed to get my book out at just the right time. And so if there's any takeaway from tonight that has nothing to do with this, it's a lot of times success in life is dumb luck. I think I'm really kind of an example of that. Now, I did kind of sense something was going on. We saw increased zombie films after 9/11. We kind of saw a resurgence in 2002, but I wasn't even a zombie fan. I hadn't really even seen any zombie movies. I just knew I had to go back to grad school, and I had to come up with a dissertation topic that no one had written yet. And because, well, full disclosure, I'm really lazy as a scholar, so I wanted to write about something nobody had written about before, so I would have less work to do. So I didn't have to do a lot of a literature review. I read everything that had been written about zombies in a week, because there wasn't anything back then. And so I started working on it, and then everything just kind of went nuts. In my 2010 book, I kind of end it with the thought that maybe zombies are over, and maybe we won't see them very much anymore, but there might be a chance the Walking Dead TV show is good. That was my conclusion. I also predicted that we would see a rise in werewolf narratives, which I don't think we've particularly seen, so I was wrong on there. But I do want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, Freud. It's part of your series, so I'm really glad to be here. My brother has an advanced degree in psychology. My mother's degree is in child psychology. And they both tell me that they don't really care about Freud because he's been debunked and nobody cares about him anymore. But in literary theory, in literary studies, we love Freud. We love Freud because he's much more easy to understand than Lacan, because we all hate Lacan. But Freud we can get behind, and we're really excited about Freud. And as I was starting to look at zombies, I realized that as far as psychoanalytic theory goes, Freud's the guy. Because it all comes down to this idea of the uncanny, which is this really simple little essay he wrote in 1919. How many have read it? Anybody read the Uncanny essay? Good. It's a great one. It's pretty easy to follow and pretty easy to understand. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit for you tonight. So I did write a little bit. I wrote something of a introduction kind of blurb on what I was going to talk about. But I know you didn't want me to listen to me read a paper, so I didn't want to read a whole paper. But I'll give you this. Almost 100 years ago, Freud theorized the concept of the uncanny, images and impulses simultaneously familiar and unfamiliar that use their cognitive dissonance to effect a return of the repressed, a creeping awareness of those frightening things we once knew but have since forgotten. A particularly insidious example of the uncanny are zombies, liminal creatures, both alive and dead, both hale and decrepit, both known and unknown, that abjectly remind us of the thing we strive to repress most, our own inevitable mortality. These poignant memento mori haunt us, pursuing our repressive psyche more effectively than they pursue their feckless victims, forcing us to confront not only our impending deaths, but a host of other fears and anxieties. The uncanny zombie forces such concerns to the fore, and thus function as a weird kind of cathartic psychoanalytic therapy. At least that's what I think. So that's the zombie. So when you think about the zombie and what it is and what it's become, you kind of have to think about when it was big. Zombie movies started in the 30s, which is no surprise because that was the first great decade of horror films, particularly in America. So we had lots of horror movies come out in the 30s, primarily because we were reacting to the Great Depression. So when you're greatly depressed, you want to go and be distracted from it. So you may not have a job and you may be starving, but at least monsters aren't trying to kill you. Go to the movies. The next great decade for horror film is really the late 60s, early 70s, but we usually just kind of talk about the 70s, and that's when we needed horror films to help us deal with Vietnam, the horrors of seeing warfare broadcast on television for the first time, where we were seeing injured, dead, and dismembered bodies on the nightly news. It was very traumatic as a country, and so horror films came back into vogue as a way to cathartically deal with those problems. Let's go see a horror movie. It'll make us forget how awful things are. It'll help us cope. Well, not surprisingly, we've seen a resurgence in horror films since 2002. And I argue this is almost exclusively because of our national reaction to 9/11. We had kind of gotten used to being untouched, to not really having to look at violence and horror and problems like that. And so when it came crashing down on us, we needed an outlet. And we also had the stock market crash as well. So it's kind of like the conditions from the 30s and the 70s combined to give us the last decade that we've kind of struggled through. And so once again, horror movies were really useful for us to work through these issues. It's no surprise that every major horror film from the 1970s has been remade in the last 10 years. So We had to come back to things. We had to rework through things. New generation, new issues, new problems. But let's talk about the uncanny, because that's why you're here, I guess. The uncanny from 1919. So there's some things that Freud said to try to explain this term. The uncanny belongs to the realm of the frightening, of what evokes fear and dread. But that doesn't mean that everything that is frightening, fearful, or dreadful is uncanny. It can be terrifying. It can be horrifying. Those are some words we use a lot. Terror generally expresses the thing that is in your head. So you don't see terror, you expect terror. We often use the term suspense to kind of describe those kinds of narratives. So you're afraid of what might be on the other side of the door. That's terror. Horror is when you actually see it. That's when you see the blood and the guts and the violence, and it's right there in your face. The uncanny is something a little bit different, a little bit more nuanced. He goes on to say, the uncanny is that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar. And this is where Freud really plays with his language, and we're going to parse this out in a minute. But he talks about this friction between what is familiar and what is unfamiliar. So when you see, and I'll talk about this more in detail later, but when you see something very familiar, you don't react negatively to it. You're not frightened of something that's really familiar. But frankly, Freud says when you encounter something completely unfamiliar, you also don't react with fright because you don't know what you're looking at. It's kind of like, I don't know what that is. But the uncanny occurs where those two things intersect. So even though this is about zombies, this is the example I like to give. I like to talk about vampires initially because it's a really easy way to kind of get this sense of the familiar and the unfamiliar combined. So a vampire is just a dude, just a normal guy, maybe a woman, right? And you think, okay, that's a human being. I've seen a human being before. But you go, that's a little weird human being. He has no neck. And he's got kind of weird claws on his fingers. I guess that's possible, but look at those teeth and ears. So Max Schreck is a great example of this. Christopher Lee's a little more subtle. He does have the red eyes, but that could be a thing. And he's got these fangs. So you kind of look at a vampire and you go, hey, I know what that is. No, I don't. Yeah. Okay, and so it's that kind of confluence of the two that gives us a little bit of a shock, a little bit of an unfamiliarity. In Dracula, one of the great examples of this that is pretty much never visualized on film is Jonathan Harker's real uncanny moment when he meets Count Dracula is when he shakes his hand and realizes Dracula has fur on his palms. It's just a moment in the novel, and a lot of people don't remember it, but that's when Harker's kind of like, ew, that's weird. Because it's like, otherwise he's totally fine, but that little, hair on the palm, we don't like that. So you kind of think about it in these terms, what you know but what you don't know. Who speaks German? German speakers. Woo, just me and a half, a sheepish half over there. Heimlich. I'll give you the full German treatment. Heimlich is one of the terms that he plays with, and Freud loves to play with words. He loves to play around with words. I have a minor in German, so I was really happy to use it when I studied Freud. Heimlich, that's the root word Heim, means two different things in German, because he's funny like that. On the one hand, it can mean, well, Heim by itself means home. So Heimlich can mean of the house, it can mean intimate, it can mean not strange, and it can mean familiar. Right? It's in your house, it's your home, it's your thing, you know what's going on. It's Heimlich. But then guess what? Heim is also the same root word as geheim. And geheim, for some strange reason in German, means secret. So Heimlich also means concealed, kept hidden, secret, and unfamiliar. This is why German is a fun language. They have a word that means both familiar and unfamiliar. It's an easy language. They just kind of play around with that. So Freud knows this double meaning exists, and his whole argument is based on this slippage of terminology. So he says, Heimlich thus becomes increasingly ambivalent until it finally merges with its antonym, unheimlich. Because if Heimlich means familiar, unheimlich means unfamiliar, which is also what Heimlich means, because unheimlich can also mean familiar. So it's a great term. It's one of these great theoretical terms that people get really excited about, like jouissance. which I still am not entirely sure what it means. I think it just means sex, but we're not allowed to talk about that in Utah. I've only known what I've read in books. So let's talk about unheimlich. Unheimlich, this is the word we translate as uncanny. Uncanny. Yeah, it doesn't really work. This is what he says about this. This word, heimlich, is not unambiguous, but belongs to two sets of ideas, which are not mutually contradictory, even though he kind of just proved they were. But they're very different from each other. The one relating to what is familiar and comfortable, the other to what is concealed and kept hidden. Okay. The term uncanny applies to everything that was intended to remain secret, hidden away, and has come into the open. So this is what he's really playing with. One of the great images that might help you with this idea is like a skeleton in the closet, which of course hopefully isn't literal. I don't know what your home life is like. But the idea that you have these secrets, but sometimes the secrets are in the house or part of the house or part of the home. And so the revelation of those secrets has this little friction again because it shouldn't be a secret in that space, but it is secretive and that's where it comes out. So you may all have some little family secrets. Maybe you don't know, because they're still a secret. So let me break down the uncanny the way he does. So he gives lots of examples of how the uncanny manifests daily. Stuffed animals. You ever been creeped out by a stuffed animal? Yeah. Maybe. Doll, more likely. I had a friend in high school whose mom made dolls, and she had a doll about this high out of porcelain, kept it in a glass case. Terrifying. I just kept waiting to come down one day and find a little hole broken in the glass. There's a movie out right now about that. Dolls are creepy. Glass dolls, porcelain dolls are particularly creepy. You go into the room and they're looking at you. Also, this is another great German term that's kind of slipped over into English. Doppelganger. The doppelganger, the double goer, the double. You've all done that, right? You're traveling and you're somewhere and you're walking along and you see someone you know. And you go, hey, there's no way that's who I think it is. Because they can't be here. I've been going through this thing now in my age where I will see someone who looks like they did in high school. I'm like, hey, there's that. There's no way they could still look that way. There's no way that's that person. And you kind of get a little freaked out. You get what Joss Whedon would call the Wiggins, which is as good a term as any. So you kind of go, hey. Any kind of repetition. So deja vu, right? Deja vu, you're like, I don't know what just happened, but I think I've done it before. Or when you have some kind of weird memory, or when you have some kind of memory trigger, like from an aroma, you smell something and you're like, something's weird here. Now, in terms of what we're talking about, particularly in the world of fiction, here are some other things that are particularly uncanny. Dead bodies are uncanny. You've been to a viewing? Okay, this is something that we do kind of in most Western cultures. We dress the body up in a coffin so we can go look at it, which is a little morbid. But the body in the coffin looks like your grandpa, but isn't your grandpa. Doesn't quite look right. It's a little waxy. I took my kids to my grandfather's funeral, and they weren't scared, but they were a little weirded out. It's like, is that really grandpa? They don't know what they're looking at. Revenants, that's a great term we don't use enough. Revenants kind of includes stuff like vampires and zombies and things that come back from the dead. Spirits, ghosts, that kind of thing. But the key for Freud is the animation of the inanimate. He thinks that's the one that really kicks it. So again, you can see a doll and be a little creeped out, but that doll starts moving, I'm pretty sure you're out of the house down the road. So dolls, good. Moving dolls, no. Dead bodies, okay. Moving dead bodies, we have a problem here. Okay, so this is all that's going on. So this leads us up, this idea of animate versus inanimate, familiar versus unfamiliar, human versus non-human. It gives us what Masahiro Mori came up with in 1970, the uncanny valley. Okay, now this chart of his has been modified a little bit over the last 50 years or so, but it's still pretty relevant and it still says quite a bit of interesting things. So it's a pretty straightforward chart. So you've got the idea of familiarity over here on this axis. So up here is really familiar. Okay, this is, we know what we're looking at. This is, I don't know what that is. That's really weird. And then along the spectrum we have doesn't look at all like a human and looks exactly like a human. And he charts this out in two different ways. So if we're talking about an inanimate object, like a doll, As it starts to look more and more human, it gets a little bit more familiar. But it's never going to be super familiar as long as it doesn't look super real. But what he said is as you get closer and closer to familiar, closer and closer to realistic, closer and closer to human, suddenly it drops into the very unfamiliar territory before it comes back up and looks familiar. This is extreme when it's motion, when motion is involved. So if you build something that doesn't look like a human and moves, we're okay, we can handle that. It starts looking more like a human, well that's cool, we're familiar with that. And then once it starts looking a little too human, we're like, I don't like it anymore, now I'm really put out by it. And this valley is the uncanny valley. He says this is where we get really freaked out. So let's talk about robots really quick. Robots are easy. So here's your industrial and your humanoid. Okay, so generally speaking, these two don't bug us too much. But I bet if we took a poll, you're more wigged out by C-3PO than R2-D2. Because R2-D2 is just kind of like a lovable trash can. And he has some facial expressions, sort of, and he makes some cool beeps and stuff. But whatever, we know he's a robot. You start getting over into C-3PO territory, and you're kind of like, what is this guy? What's his deal? You want to be more human? Why is he so obnoxious? So you kind of, well, 3PO has his own baggage for many other reasons. But as we're okay, this is more familiar to us than this, and this is not uncanny yet, because we can clearly tell he's not human. Right? He's got the wires exposed, he doesn't move too well. So we're kind of okay with that. That's the industrial robot and the humanoid robot. But then as we start getting closer to the corpse and the zombie, we get really freaked out. All right, in preparing this, I Googled images of corpse. Don't. Ever. Okay, that was a very short-lived moment of my life. I thought the internet had some standards. Foolish me. There's some really awful stuff online. So I'm not giving you an image of a corpse, I'm just going to give you a zombie. So this is the famous bicycle zombie from the Walking Dead pilot. But it can kind of work to illustrate both. So corpse, it freaks us out a little bit. It doesn't look quite right, especially if it's mangled or rotten or a little bit messed up. But we're still okay unless it's moving. Once it's moving, then the valley drops significantly. Because it shouldn't be. So as you go up on this chart, you have these bunraku puppets. That's what these things are. They're looking a little bit more human, which makes us a little bit uncomfortable. Especially because they are motion, they're puppetry. But you kind of have a suspension of disbelief. You kind of know they're not real. But the ones that look more real are a little bit more creepy than the ones that don't, until they look really real and then they don't bug you anymore. But what about these two here? So this is one of the famous examples. Polar Express didn't do well, and that's because everyone said it hit the valley head on. The characters weren't cartoon enough, and they weren't realistic enough. Instead, they were just weird. And so everybody was kind of creeped out by the Polar Express. The Final Fantasy movie, Spirits Within, was similar. They weren't quite photorealistic enough. Whereas the CGI in Dawn of the Rise of the Day of the Planet of the Apes, whatever the one was that was this summer, I honestly don't remember. But the motion capture technology for Caesar in that film, most of that movie I thought I was watching a chimpanzee. So it didn't bug me. I just thought it's a chimpanzee, even though it's CGI. The CGI had come so far over to the level of realism that it entered into the sphere of comfortable. But this is the Actroid F robot that they're working on over in Japan. And I just wanted to show you a little video so you could see it in action, because the action is important. So she's mostly just kind of nodding and hanging out, blinking. So the question is, are you thinking, okay, that's a human being, I'm cool with the human being? Or are you thinking, oh, that's just a robot, I'm cool with the robot? Or are you thinking, I don't know what this is. There's a problem here. Maury would probably say we shouldn't be trying to do this. Well, we do. We love to do it. So let's talk about how this manifests in our fiction. Because my degree is in English, technically. So I'm really interested in narrative. I'm interested in how narrative works. I'm interested in how we tell stories. And I'm particularly interested in what kind of stories we tell at certain times in history. Because I'm a cultural critic, but I'm also a new historicist. And I like to kind of ask those questions. Why are certain things popular in certain moments in time? So let's talk about the uncanny and how it manifests in works of fiction, which can be novels, can be comics, can be video games, and especially can be movies and television. So one of the things that I've alluded to and Freud talks about is the uncanny requires tension between the familiar and the unfamiliar. It doesn't work if it's only one or the other. So in a universe that is completely fantasy, the uncanny can't really exist. So I used the example from Star Wars before, but Star Wars is a universe that's filled with monsters and aliens and robots and creatures. So because everything is somewhat unfamiliar, nothing can be uncanny. The uncanny can only really come out if you're in a narrative that is otherwise realistic. And some could define this type of genre as the fabulous, where it's our world and it's everything is normal except this one weird thing. So it's the world we know and love, there just happen to be vampires. It's the world we know and love, there's just a secret world of wizards. And that's important to recognize because Harry Potter is uncanny until he goes to Hogwarts, and then it ceases to be. Because then we switch over to the fantasy world where everything is weird, so nothing is uncomfortable. So it's that slippage that's really important. So what he says is, many things that would be bound to seem uncanny if they happen in real life are not so in the realm of fiction because they have to have that appropriate balance of the familiar and the unfamiliar in order to work. So that brings us to Night of the Living Dead. I gave a lecture on this last night. I won't give you the same one because it'll take too long. This is the film that's made my career, so thanks, George. He set out to adapt I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, recently recognized by the Bram Stoker Society as the best vampire novel of the 20th century. Guess who they gave it to for the 19th century. I really like I Am Legend. If you haven't read it, you should pick it up. It's a novella. It's the first story that flips the narrative. Instead of there being like one vampire